Hi, this is Grandpa from Grammy and Grandpa Read, and today's book is Runaway Thanksgiving by Louise Mandrell Ace Collins, a story about the meaning of Thanksgiving. And it's still, here we go. Gobble, gobble, gobble. The sun was just peeking its yellow head above the trees as Reba Blair slowly sat up and shook the drowsiness from her head. Rubbing her deep green eyes, she glanced across the log cabin's still dark loft at her three younger brothers and sisters. They were soundly asleep on the straw-filled mattress they shared. She couldn't believe the turkey hadn't awakened them, but it was just as well. They didn't really need to get up now. They were still too young to do chores. Seeing her three siblings huddled together under the green and yellow quilt, Reba couldn't help but wish she were 4 instead of 11 when she could sleep too. Reba finished tying her 2 pigtails, put on the new red and white dress her grandmother had sent all the way from Virginia, and climbed down the ladder that led from the loft to the cabin's other room. The dirt floor, warmed by the heat of the fireplace, felt good to her bare feet, and the smell of the homemade bread, already baking in the black cast iron pot, made her very hungry. "Good morning, Reba," her mother sang out from a chair by the fire. "My, doesn't that dress look fine?" "Thank you," Reba answered, smiling at her mother. "The bread sure does smell good." Then, noticing an addition to the fireplace, she added, "What are you going to cook in that spit?" "The bread's for later," Minnie Blair answered. "What I'm going to cook is a surprise. There's cornbread and blackberry jelly on the table for breakfast. Your father should be back with milk soon. And my goodness, as soon as you get a chance, feed that turkey of yours. He's been making a racket all morning." "He's just lonely, Mama," Reba said, defending her pet. "He's a pest," her mother replied. "He eats as much as a flock of chickens, doesn't have a lick of sense, and every time someone leaves the door open, he thinks it's an invitation for him to come in. If you don't put him in the barn, he'll probably drown in a rainstorm." Reba was about to protest when she heard a scratching on the door. Biting her lips, she turned slowly, all of the while praying that Moses the turkey would stop before her mother heard him. He didn't. "There he is now," her mother said, pointing her finger at the door. Why we ever let you raise him is beyond me, and the way you spoil him as fat as he is." Before she could finish her sentence, Tom Blair came through the door, a milk pail in each hand. "Morning, Reba," he said merrily as he passed her. "Old Moses is about to drive all the other animals crazy with his begging and squawking. You'd better grab some corn and feed him before he wakes everybody between here and Boone's Station." Putting down the pails, he turned to his wife and added, "My axe is so dull it would barely chop the wood this morning." Not even waiting for a cup of milk, Reba hurried outside for her black feathered friend. "Please, Moses," she scolded, "be quiet. Mama's getting really upset. There's no telling what she'll do if you don't start behaving." Lifting the lid off the wooden feed bucket, Reba grabbed a handful of corn and tossed it on the ground. She laughed as Moses scrambled after every kernel, pushing aside a bored yellow cat. She seated herself on an old tree stump to watch her pet turkey. This morning, the air was crisp. The trees wore coats of yellow, red, and orange, and the brown grass crunched underfoot. This was the warmest fall since the Blairs had moved to Kentucky from Jamestown, Virginia, in 1784. Now, sitting on the stump with the sun warming her back, Reba remembered coming to Kentucky and getting her first pet. That first year, Reba had been so lonely for her friends and grandparents that her father had felt sorry for her and had given her a turkey chick. From the time it was a few weeks old, it followed her everywhere she went. She loved it, taking care of it, and named it Moses. And 3 years later, with the nearest neighbor 2 miles away, Moses was still her only regular playmate. She depended on him for company and sometimes felt he was listening to her, that he understood her, that he was almost human. "Come on, Moses," she teased as he finished his breakfast. "Let's play dress up." Running to the back of the cabin, she pulled a small vest and bonnet from a rope that ran from the lean-to barn to the fence. She had sewn these clothes for Moses all by herself, using one of her mother's worn-out dresses and making the patterns as best she could. It wasn't easy to fit a turkey. Reba put the clothes on Moses and laughed and laughed. Moses only gobbled, scratching proudly in the dirt. As his tail spread, he seemed to enjoy being the best-dressed bird west of the Alleghenies. The two friends began dancing in the grass. Finally, out of breath, Reba laughed. "Moses, I can't dance with you anymore. I've got to feed the chickens, gather the eggs, and help churn the butter. And before I do all that, I've got to finish my breakfast. I'll race you to the door." Reba dashed back to the front of the house, leaping over a log, an old wagon wheel, and a sleeping dog. Moses, dressed in his Sunday best, took the same route, except he didn't clear the last obstacle. When he landed, he dug his claws deeply into the hound's back. Rex didn't like having his morning nap interrupted by anyone, especially an overgrown feather duster. Joining the chase, the dog was just about to snap at the bird's neck when he heard Reba's shrill voice. "Rex," she hollered, "if you so much as touch one feather, I'll take a broom to you and chase you clear to the Cumberland River." Scowling, Rex hung his head and loped off toward the woods. Maybe there he could find a warm sunbeam and a little peace. Still out of breath, Reba was just opening the front door when something in her mother's tone told her she should wait outside. "I think we should tell Reba," her mother sighed. "She's a big girl." "No," she heard her father say. "This needs to be a surprise. You know how she is. This might scare her." "She's lived out here for 3 years and she's 11 years old," her mother argued. "She could help us." "No," her father replied. "I don't want her to know that we're having my friends over for a Thanksgiving celebration. After all, she's never met them. I'll keep her busy outside and she'll never realize anything is going on. Now, have you got everything you need for the meal?" "Everything except the turkey," her mother answered. "The turkey will be no problem," her father replied. "I expect that the bird will appear at our door in no time. The morning's a-wasting and I need to sharpen my axe." Panic hit Reba like a lightning bolt. A turkey for lunch? Sharpen the axe? Horrified, she eased the door shut. Eyeing the turkey's long neck, Reba told him, "I guess you know why he needs to sharpen the axe. I don't think you're welcome around here anymore, but I won't let them hurt you. We've got to run away." Grabbing a piece of rope from the split rail fence, she made a loop and put it around the turkey's neck. Reba looked back one last time at the cabin and then hurried down the trail that led to the woods, pulling Moses behind her. For the first mile, the woods were so thick that Reba could barely see the sky. It was only by staying on the well-worn path that she made any progress at all. Even then, she kept catching her dress on thorn bushes. Finally, at Miller's Creek, the forest thinned out and opened into a large meadow. When Reba and Moses emerged from the woods, they startled a group of more than a dozen deer that had stopped at the meadow to graze. The deer eyed the strange twosome for a few seconds, then deciding that neither of them posed a threat, resumed their search for food. "Daddy could have shot a deer instead," Reba moaned as she watched the herd. "Then he wouldn't have to. My goodness, Moses, look at that." Pulling on the rope, she guided the turkey back into the woods and threw her arms around him. "Moses, did you see what I saw?" Peering out from behind a big oak tree, Reba watched 3 buckskin-clad Indian braves, 2 young and 1 old, cross the creek. "Don't make a sound," she whispered to Moses. The 3 men wore feathers in their hair, carried rifles 6 feet long. Stopping On the bank, one of the young ones raised his gun and pointed it at the largest deer. Before he could shoot, the older one touched his shoulder. Nodding, the brave lowered the weapon. Reba noticed that the old Indian was carrying a dead turkey. They're on a turkey shoot, she thought, and the one that they have is not nearly as fat as Moses. Reba's heart was beating so hard she was sure the Indians could hear it. She had never been so scared. Looking down at her bird, she put her finger in front of her lips and silently pleaded, "Shh." But Moses, who never could be quiet for long, simply turned his head to one side and sung out, "Gobble, gobble." Reba was terrified. At any moment, she felt the savages would discover her hiding place. They would shoot Moses with their long rifles and kidnap Reba, dragging her off to their camp. She would never see her parents again. But when she peeked out from behind the trees, she saw that the Indians were not coming toward her. They were walking away. They were crossing the meadow and entering the woods on the same path she had just come from. In no time, they were gone, but she was too frightened to come out. She huddled behind the tree, shaking and hugging Moses to her for a long time. "Moses," Reba sighed as she finally left the shelter of the woods and walked toward the creek. "We were lucky this time, but what about next time?" It was then that the real hopelessness of the situation hit her, and she was overwhelmed with loneliness and fear. She couldn't really run away. Where would she go? She couldn't live by herself in a forest filled with Indians and wild animals. What would she eat? Where would she sleep? What would she do when it got cold? She let go of Moses's rope, and the turkey sidled down toward the creek. Carefully, he picked his way to the bank. After staring at the water for some time, he leaned down and filled up his small beak, then straightened up and shook his neck until the few drops he had slid down his long throat. He repeated this ritual again and again. Reba had often wondered how Moses kept from either dying of thirst or shaking himself to death. He seemed to go to so much trouble for so little gain. Sitting down on an old log, she watched the bird. He was completely without understanding. In his mind, life was as simple as it had ever been. He had faith in everyone around him. He didn't know that people could be cruel. "Moses," Reba sighed as she came to a decision, "I've got to let you go." Slipping the rope over the turkey's head, Reba wiped a tear from her eye. The trusting bird craned his head to the side and stared at the little girl. "Gobble." The turkey's familiar call seemed so sad to Reba that she felt torn apart. She just couldn't leave him. She was reaching to slip the rope back over his head when she heard rustling in the brush behind her. She froze with fear as she felt hot breath on the back of her neck. Trembling, she got up from the log and turned around to find herself face to face with the biggest black bear she had ever seen. For what seemed like forever, the three of them, Reba, Moses, and the bear, just stared at one another. Then, as the Bruin stood up on his hind legs, and as the girl and the turkey slowly raised their heads, their eyes following him up to his full 6-foot height, things quickly changed. Reba screamed, ran right under the bear's upraised right paw, and dashed across the meadow, letting loose his own blood-curdling call. Moses streaked under the other paw and ran toward the woods. The bear, confused, looked from one to the other, trying to decide which to chase. It was quite a choice. He had never seen a turkey dressed like a blue gingham, and the little girls in long dresses were new to him too. Then Moses disappeared into the woods, and the bear lumbered after Reba. Running as hard as she could, Reba could hear him crashing through the brush behind her. With each step, she felt that he was getting closer, pushing on through the tall, dry grass. She had almost reached the woods when she tripped on a fallen tree limb. As the dark blue of fur closed in, she frantically tried to get up, but the hem of her dress had caught on a branch. Mightily she pulled, but the dress wouldn't budge. Reba glanced back, saw the bear charging and yanked with all her might. There was a tearing sound, and she was free, though a piece of her brand new dress had been ripped away. Twirling around, she raced for the only tree that had a limb low enough to grab. Just as she caught the branch, the bear came roaring at her. Using the last bit of strength she could muster, Reba scampered up the thin sycamore. As the bear leaped for her, he jumped to try to reach her with his claws, but caught only a small piece of red and white fabric. Reba had eluded him. Climbing as fast as she could, Reba found a strong perch halfway up the tree. She settled in and breathed a sigh of relief. She was safe. But suddenly the tree began to sway. The bear was shaking the tree. Using all his strength, he pushed and pulled. Reba clung desperately to the trunk. Just then, she heard a familiar buzzing sound. She peered up through the branches and recognized a beehive a few feet above her head. The bees, upset at having their home shaken up, were buzzing about in an angry swarm. They began to dive at Reba, venting their wrath on her. Desperately, she shooed them away with one hand and hung on to the tree with the other. Just as she was wondering whether it would be better to be mauled by an angry bear or stung by hundreds of mad bees, a shot rang out, and a speeding lead ball buzzed by her head. The bear, not even looking for the person who had fired the rifle, raced for safety of the woods. Meanwhile, the lead ball hit the very top of the beehive, and the bees, hive and all, hurtled to the ground. Reba, suddenly free of both her problems, watched a tall man wearing a coonskin cap and carrying a long rifle stride out from the shadow of the woods. "Are you all right?" he hollered. "Yes, sir," she replied. "You can climb down now," the stranger said. He stuck his gun barrel through the hive and carried it quickly across the meadow. By the time he returned, Reba was back on the ground, frightened but unharmed. "I'm Daniel Boone," the man smiled. "I'm Reba Blair," she answered, beginning to cry. "Tom Blair's daughter?" he asked. "Yes," Reba sniffled. "What are you doing out here by yourself, Reba?" he asked. "I'm in a lot of trouble." With that admission, she proceeded to tell the famous woodsman her story. "Well, we need to get you home," Daniel assured her. "But before we do, I think I'll go over to that hive and get some honey. Then we'll get your turkey." "You've seen Moses?" she asked hopefully. "Yes," Daniel grinned. "It's a good thing you told me your story. I thought my eyesight was a bit daffy when I spotted a big turkey wearing a vest and a bonnet. I figured when the animals start getting civilized enough to dress for holidays, it might be time for me to move further west." Laughing, the big man pointed toward the creek and added, "I think we'll find him over there." Then the three of them, Daniel, Reba, and her pet, began the long walk home. An hour later, they were back at the Blairs' log cabin. As they approached, Reba's mother came rushing out. "Reba," she cried as she spread her arms, "where have you been? We've been so worried, and what happened to you? Your clothes are torn." "Oh, Mama," Reba sobbed. Her mother hugged her. "Your father has been frantic," she said. "He's been out searching for you." "Oh, dear, I'm supposed to fire off a gun if you come home before he does." Daniel smiled. "I'll take care of that." Aiming his gun into the sky, he squeezed the trigger. The rifle's roar brought Reba's father running, and there were 3 Indians with him. "Daddy," Reba cried, falling into her father's arms. "I'm so sorry I worried you, but I couldn't let you cook Moses for dinner. I just couldn't." "Cook Moses?" Father exclaimed. "We were never going to cook Moses for dinner." "But I heard you and Mama talking," Reba started to explain. "You silly girl," her father laughed. "We weren't talking about Moses. He's your pet and always will be. We were talking about the turkey Red Wolf brought." And he gestured at one of the Indians. Why, they were the same Indians Reba had seen at Miller's Creek, and they had been carrying a turkey with them. She felt weak with relief. Moses was safe. Her father began introducing the Indians to Daniel Boone. "Daniel, I want you to meet the Indian who once saved our lives." "I know Red Wolf," Daniel answered and greeted the Indian. "Dinner's ready, Tom," Minnie Blair announced happily. "Daniel," Tom said, "Boone's station is a far piece from here. Will you join us at our table this Thanksgiving? We have plenty." Daniel nodded his coonskin-covered head. Thank you, Tom. I'd appreciate that. And I've got some honey right here in my backpack that will go really well with the bread I smell. Then Reba, with her mother and her father and her 3 younger brothers and sisters, sat down to Thanksgiving dinner with Red Wolf, his 2 sons, and Daniel Boone. Perhaps their feast looked much like the first Pilgrim Thanksgiving. Certainly they had as much to be thankful for. Reba's mother and father gave thanks that she was home safe again. Reba gave thanks that her pet turkey was safe and sound. And maybe even Moses himself gave thanks for whatever turkeys are thankful for. During the meal, Daniel leaned over to Reba, smiling his crooked smile. I want to tell you a story, he said. When your father first moved here, he was afraid of Red Wolf. He just assumed the worst about the Indian. Then, when the hard winter arrived and your family was close to starving, Red Wolf came to visit. Your father met him with a gun. Red Wolf could have felt threatened by that and gotten his own gun or even prepared for war. Instead, Red Wolf stayed and talked. He explained that he just wanted to share what he had with his suffering family. Your father listened and put down his gun, and the 2 of them became fast friends. This morning, you jumped to conclusions before you talked things out. If you had asked your parents a few questions, then you would have saved all of us a great deal of worry. Chuckling, he added, and then Moses would not have to wander all over the wilderness. You're right, Mr. Boone, Reba replied. In the future, I'll talk first before I make up my mind to do anything drastic. Nodding his head, the frontiersman added, if we would all do that, we would have a world that could really celebrate Thanksgiving in peace. Now, why don't you pass me some of that honey for this piece of hot bread? As Reba reached for the honey, she heard a familiar scratching at the door. Everyone at the table turned in unison toward the sound. Just as they did, the door flew open, and Moses, still wearing his bonnet and vest, walked in. So help me, Minnie Blair said as she leapt from her chair. If I catch that bird in this house one more time, I'll cook him. Then, catching sight of her daughter's worried expression, she smiled and added, the finest Thanksgiving dinner he's ever had. As Moses crooked his neck to one side, everyone laughed. Standing in the doorway, he raised his head proudly. Gobble, 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 he cried. That was kind of a fun story. I love stories about Daniel Boone. Anyway, if you like this book, smash the like button down below. Give us a big thumbs up. Subscribe to our channel and watch the playlist for Thanksgiving.